Welcome to my film, in which we take a 4-month voyage by sea from the United Kingdom to Australia. The ship we will be travelling in is called the MV Mystic, a general cargo ship weighing just under 7,000 tonnes, launched in 1959 and operated by Shaw, Savill and Albion Lines. Since there are a great number of ship prefixes, you may be unfamiliar with them. The most usual ones are MV or MS, indicating a motor vessel or motor ship, SS for a steamship, RMS for a Royal Mail ship, and RV for a search vessel. Naval ships have their own designations. Prior to the introduction of air freight and container ships, if you wanted to import or export anything from tacks to tanks, the general cargo ship was your only option. The only exceptions to this would be the carriage of liquids, such as oil, or bulk carriers for iron ore or coal, where specialist designs were needed. Ships of the British Merchant Marine, the largest commercial navy in the world at that time, were operated by a large number of independent shipping companies, offering freight and passenger services to every point on the globe. Shaw, Savill and Albion Line, whose house flag you see here, was originally founded in 1882 to trade to Australia and New Zealand. Having passed through ownership by the White Star Line, it was acquired in 1933 by Furness Withy & Company to expand their services there. I was apprenticed with them as a deck cadet from 1959 to 1962, when this film was made. Here we have a general view of our ship, moored starboard side or right side to in Hornby branch of Liverpool's Gladstone dock, loading our outbound cargo. General cargo ships would have between 3 and 6 holds, each with their own set of cranes, known as derricks. We have 5 holds, and the first 3 are in the forward part of the ship, together with their associated derricks, which could handle loads up to 10 tons. And here there is also a heavy lift derrick, capable of handling loads up to 50 tons. Each hold also has a compartment known as a deep tank, where we could carry bulk liquids or grain when required. Numbers 4 and 5 holds are aft of the accommodation, and you can see the derricks attached to the mast. Where there is no mast, we use dummy ones called Samson posts. Here they also have deep tanks for liquids and grain. This diagram shows the general layout of a hold, and you can see that there were usually either 1 or 2 upper decks within, which were called tween decks. Apart from making cargo distribution easier, the tween decks contained specialist compartments, for example for refrigerated cargoes or secure areas for high-value goods. Naturally, there were hatch covers to close off the lower areas when needed. We begin our voyage in the historic Liverpool docks. The world's first enclosed commercial dock was built here in 1715, and over the years the docks were developed into an interconnecting series of secure basins incorporating locks, which extended 7.5 miles along the Liverpool bank of the River Mersey. This system was the most advanced in the world, and enabled ship movements within it 24 hours a day, regardless of the state of the tide, which here has one of the highest ranges in the UK. However, the increasing size of modern ships and the introduction of container ships restricted the use of the smaller docks, and by 1975 most had been closed and have subsequently been redeveloped. However, the size of the northwestern lock, known as Gladstone Lock, originally used by the huge transatlantic liners, enabled the building of Seaforth Dock in 1972, and this is now Liverpool's main container berth, and is also used for bulk grain handling. Gladstone Dock, the lock's original destination, remains in use to import biomass and coal, and to export scrap metal. Its former branches, Hornby No. 1 and No. 2, where we're currently moored, have since been filled in to enable the expansion of Gladstone's facilities. We're ready to sail, and the international code flag P, universally known as the Blue Peter, is calling everyone to return on board. However, there's a force 11 gale blowing outside, nearly hurricane force, which makes any sort of movement impossibly dangerous. We'll be needing a pilot when we do leave, so while we wait for the wind to die down, perhaps a quick explanation of his role would be helpful. Although the captain always retains ultimate responsibility, each port visited will have different conditions, and he clearly can't know the detail of every one of them. This is where the pilot comes in. He'll be a local expert with an intimate knowledge of his own area, so he can provide detailed guidance with the manoeuvring. When we need a pilot, we fly the international code flag G, and when he is on board, this is changed to H. Finally, after a delay of nearly 4 days, the wind has abated and the pilot's on board. Engine orders are passed and acknowledged using the telegraph, which provides a mechanical link between the bridge and the engine room. The crew let go the mooring ropes, and we're now moving gently astern out of the branch dock, with a tug at each end of the ship to help us with manoeuvring. Their distinctive funnel colours show they belong to our own Furnace Withy group. At that time, most cargo ships only had one propeller and didn't have the advantages of modern bow thrusters to help in moving sideways, so tug assistance was very necessary. Tug handling requires a very high degree of skill from its crews. As he prepares to stop engines, you may notice the pilot using the ship's whistle by pulling on a rope. This is to warn other ships of his intentions. 1 blast indicates a turn to starboard or right, 2 for a port or left turn, and 3 to indicate coming astern or backwards. Having passed through the link channel into Gladstone Dock proper, we get a sight of the lock through to the river, where our voyage really begins. We must now swing the ship, passing the other moored ships as we go, and you can see how busy the dock was at this time. Only 2 of the original locks which served the Northern Dock system remain, and Gladstone Lock is one of them. Since it was originally designed to take the largest of the transatlantic steamers, it's actually larger than the original locks on the Panama Canal. Here you can see one of the huge lock gates, which weigh over 400 tons each, and as we move gently ahead, the crew are standing by fore and aft, waiting to secure the ship when ready. To get a mooring rope ashore, a heaving line, a light rope with a special weighted knot at one end, is tied onto it and then thrown across to the dockside crew. They can then haul the rope in and drop the end onto a bollard. The inboard end can then be hauled taut by a winch, and we become secure for the lock passage. Having dropped to river level, we can cast off the tugs and edge gently out into the river. Although it's quiet today, the unbelievable power of nature was demonstrated in 2005 when one of the enormous lock gates was torn from its hinges and badly damaged by a severe storm. As we turn into the river, this will be our last proper sight of the UK for the next 4 months. We're off now, so let's have a brief outline of our trip. First, we make an uninterrupted voyage through the Mediterranean to Egypt and the start of the Suez Canal. Then down the Red Sea on our way for a quick stop at Ceylon, now called Sri Lanka, before crossing the Indian Ocean to arrive at our main destination, Australia. So here we are, now finally underway, and we head southwest to cross the Bay of Biscay before turning south and then southeast to pass the Gibraltar Straits. As we go, I thought you might like to know what cargo we've loaded for the outbound trip. My notes show that among a wide variety of general goods, there were rolls of carpet, cases of machinery, old and new cars, and cases and barrels of whisky. We also loaded something called a digester vessel weighing 26 tons, and the after deep tanks were pressed into use and filled with alkane, which is apparently used as a base for detergents. Now that we're out at sea, the full effect of the Atlantic waves, known as the swell, makes things a little choppy, but adds a bit of interest. Although the sea seems very rough, it isn't really. It's just that we're heading straight into the wind and the waves, so we sometimes dip our nose into them and ship the occasional sea over the bows. Quite spectacular to watch, but not at all dangerous. Things have calmed down a bit now that we've rounded Cape St. Vincent, the southwestern corner of Spain. As we head for Gibraltar, with the Spanish coast to our left, or port, ship traffic always increases, since the straits are the only way into the Mediterranean from the west. As the Rock of Gibraltar comes into view, we pass the little ferry, scurrying over on its regular run to Tangier in North Africa. The Rock certainly dominates the scenery, and it was still a Royal Naval base in 1962, guarding the entrance as it had done since it was captured from the Spanish in 1704. We now cross the Mediterranean, heading east towards Egypt. When we're underway, we use the ship's log, a spinner on the end of a rope, to measure our distance. The trip from Liverpool to Port Said usually takes around 9 days if the weather is reasonable, and we're now arriving there to arrange our transit of the Suez Canal. As we approach, we must display signal flags to indicate who we are, and this impressive show is the result. So what do they all mean? On the left is the international code flag G, meaning I require a pilot, the black ball above being a special edition required for the canal. Next to that is the courtesy flag for the United Arab Republic, which had recently been formed with Syria. Then comes the ship's house flag, and finally our unique signal letters. From the top, G, B, T, and H. Well, it's worked, since here is the pilot boat, and he is now on board to guide us to a mooring, where we will wait for our transit. The canal is not wide enough to allow two-way traffic through it, so all ships pass through in convoy, one southbound and one northbound each day. During our visit, the southbound convoy would anchor in the middle of the canal so that the northbound one could transit without stopping. This system still operates, although there are now additional passing sections. We also prepare a derrick for use when needed. We had to arrive at Port Said before 5 p.m. if we were to join the southbound convoy that day, so we're okay for this evening, and we'll wait, secured to buoys fore and aft, and our berth is just ahead in the gathering dusk. The idea of a navigable passage from the Nile River to the Red Sea dates back to very early times, and traces of various ancient canals were discovered by French archaeologists during the reign of Napoleon Bonaparte in 1799. The modern canal, as it exists today, came about in the mid-1800s once it had been established that there was no difference in sea level between the Red Sea and the Mediterranean, and that therefore no locks would be needed. The planned route joined the two seas by incorporating three existing lakes: Lake Timseh, the Great Bitter Lake, and the Little Bitter Lake, and originally had a length of 120 miles. Under the direction of the Frenchman Ferdinand de Lesseps, the canal took 10 years to build and was finally opened in November 1869. It reduces the journey between the Indian and Atlantic Oceans by around 4,600 miles. It's recently been widened and can now handle all but the very largest supertankers. Well, here we are, in the Bitter Lake anchorage, waiting for the northbound convoy to pass. During our night passage we changed pilots at Ismailia on Lake Timseh, which is roughly halfway through the canal. Although an international treaty guarantees the right of passage to all ships, the canal has been blocked twice by conflict, the first time being in 1956, during what was known as the Suez Crisis. Then, in 1967, war broke out between Egypt and Israel, and the northbound convoy of 15 ships became trapped here in the Great Bitter Lake until 1975. Over time they became known as the Yellow Fleet, due to them being increasingly covered with sand from the desert. The crews initially met up for mutual support and even produced their own stamps, which became recognized by Egypt. As time went on, the ships were moored together and skeleton crews were appointed. At the end of the blockade, only 2 ships were able to leave under their own power, with one, the Munsterland, finally arriving in Germany after a voyage lasting 8 years, 3 months and 5 days. One assumes that her cargo of eggs and fruit were probably no longer fit for their original purpose. Fortunately, no such fate awaits us as we resume our voyage south, and the crew are standing by in case of need. We transit the Little Bitter Lake and enter the canal proper, with the convoy in front and behind us, all travelling at a maximum speed of 8 knots to reduce erosion on the banks. During the prolonged closure, there was a fear that the canal might silt up, but it was found that the lack of ships transiting enabled natural currents to keep it clear. Normally, however, constant dredging is needed to maintain the depth, and here we can see a suction dredger hard at work. The resulting silt is being pumped ashore, creating new land at the side of the canal. As well as the dredging, maintenance of the banks is an ongoing need. Although nowadays modern machinery would be used, here it's being carried out by hand, using methods nearly as old as time, and one can almost imagine the pyramids being built in much the same way. Since the canal passes through real desert country, a source of fresh water had to be found for the labourers. To achieve this, the Sweet Water Canal from Lake Timseh to Suez and Port Said was started on the western side in 1861 and took 2 years to build. It was also used to move food and materials more easily along the length of the main works. This small canal has had another effect, since where there is water there's life. Thus it's provided limited irrigation on the western bank, which has enabled some agriculture and settlements to flourish. The green nature of the area can clearly be seen to starboard as we head southwards. This side of the canal also carries a main road from north to south. The contrast with the eastern bank, however, is very marked. Here the sands of the Sinai Desert stretch away as far as the eye can see, creating an unimaginably hostile area. Nowadays, modern technology has enabled some limited use of the eastern bank, but it still remains a very unpleasant environment. This final southern section takes around 2.5 hours to transit, out of a total passage time averaging 11 hours, which includes the time at anchor. As we approach the end of our passage, the little emergency boat, provided to carry mooring ropes ashore in case of breakdowns, is offloaded, using the derrick previously prepared for the purpose. Finally, we enter Suez Bay, where we'll drop the pilot and then really start to earn our keep. A journey of a little under 2 days at our average speed of 15 knots will bring us down the Red Sea to our first port of call, Port Sudan, which is the main seaport for the country of the same name, and we're now arriving for a short visit which is expected to last around 8 hours. The pilot boat is now approaching, bringing our usual first visitor to any port. The side of a ship is a daunting sight, even one as small as ours, and the pilot needs to be fairly fit and agile to come aboard. He's climbing the specially made ladder with wooden treads, which is provided for his use and which has spreaders to prevent it from twisting. Port Sudan was laid out in the early 1900s to replace an old harbour which had become choked with coral, and is built round an inlet from the sea. As you can see, it has very extensive facilities all along the banks. It was a very busy port then and remains so to this day. The country's exports are mainly agricultural, and it's one of the world's largest producers of gum arabic or acacia gum, which is the reason for our brief visit here. The gum is primarily used as a stabilizer by the food industry, although apparently it's also a key ingredient of paint, glue and cosmetics, among other uses. As we manoeuvre to come alongside starboard side 2, we can see the dockers patiently waiting to come on board to start loading about 100 tons of it. And here is part of our shipment already stacked in these sacks, waiting for the off. Well, the loading was soon finished, and we're now on our way to the port of Aden, at the southern end of the Red Sea, which we'll reach after about 2.5 days. We're not visiting for cargo this time, but to refuel. Aden's position, roughly halfway between Suez in India and Suez and Zanzibar in Africa, has given it a strategic importance for centuries. It was a British Crown colony until independence in 1967. As you can see, the harbour lies in the crater of a dormant volcano, with another similar smaller harbour to the west, known as Little Aden, where the oil refinery and terminal are located. As we enter the main harbour, we'll be securing to mooring buoys fore and aft, and once safely secured, fuel pumping will begin, and we'll hoist the code flag B to indicate that we're loading or discharging explosives, which includes fuel. The company's house flag can also be seen to the right. Aden was originally taken over by the British in 1839 to protect shipping from pirates. Since steamships needed supplies of coal to fill their bunkers, a coaling station was soon established here at an area still known as Steamer Point. We still use the word bunkering today to describe refueling. For us as the crew, Aden's main advantage was that it was a free trade or tax-free port, and these floating markets, affectionately known as bumboats, sold all manner of goods such as cameras, watches and stereos at a fraction of the price at home. So, refuelled, restocked and refreshed, we'll now proceed to sea again on the long crossing of the Indian Ocean to Trincomalee in Sri Lanka, then known as Ceylon. As the propeller drives us out into the ocean, I thought you might like to meet the crew and see what sort of work they do. After all, Where would we be without them? The responsibility for the safety of the whole ship and everyone on board rests squarely on the shoulders of our captain, Captain Proctor, here taking his daily exercise. Many years at sea have given him immense experience, but it can still be a very lonely position. The first department that I would like to introduce you to is arguably the most important of all, our caterers and stewards, gathered in the galley for a tea break. They look after us in all weathers, which requires a very great degree of skill, and the ship would indeed be a sad place in their absence. Now we meet our wireless wizard, whom we affectionately call Sparks, who has kindly invited us into his private space, showing us a typical officer's cabin. At this time, shipping companies would hire their radio equipment and radio officers from either the Siemens or the Marconi companies, so he is actually one of their employees. It made sense, really, given the speed with which equipment was becoming obsolete. He works alone in his strange world of Morse code, keeping us in contact with the outside world. His office also contains the direction finding, or DF loop, a very useful navigational tool in the days before satellites. Next we move to the mysterious world which gives life and soul to any ship. We've already briefly met our mechanical magicians earlier in the film, and this impressive array shows the control area of their pride and joy and our beating heart, our main engine, a 6-cylinder opposed-piston Doxford diesel. Here we can see the top of the massive beast throbbing away, carrying us onward, but because the engine room is so full of other machinery, the sheer scale of it is not apparent. This picture, however, shows a similar engine, seen here in a factory workshop, and the man standing on the lower platform, if you can see him, will give you a sense of its immense size. Of course, the engineer's world is also full of all the other machinery, such as generators and pumps, which keep us safe and happy. Maintenance is a constant need, as here, where we see one of the technicians checking the propeller shaft bearings deep in the bowels of the ship. We can also meet our specialist electrician, who has his own responsibilities for everything electrical in our home. On deck, allow me to introduce our navigating officers, each of whom keeps a bridge watch twice a day, either from 12 till 4, 4 till 8, or 8 till 12. Here they're carrying out one of our most important daily rituals, the noon sight of the sun, which gives us our latitude. In the days before global positioning satellites, deep-sea navigation would be carried out using the sun and the stars, and the sextant was our main tool, so a brief explanation of how it was used might be helpful. The index arm, with its mirror, moves along a scale. The horizon mirror is half mirror and half clear glass, and the image of the object we're looking at can be reflected so that it sits on the horizon. The resulting angle can be read off. Because of a quirk of geometry, the scale can cover 120 degrees, even though the frame is only 60, which is where we get the name sextant. It's so accurate it can read angles to an accuracy of 1/300th part of a degree, or 12 seconds of arc. Now imagine that we have a lighthouse and we know its height above the sea. By measuring the angle between the top and the bottom, we can calculate how far we are away from it, the angle increasing as we get nearer. This distance produces a circular position, and by repeating the process with a second mark, we can draw the two circles, and we must be at the point where they cross. The same principles are used for the sun and the stars, except that a little more maths has to be used, due to the huge distances involved. Modern GPS is a wonderful tool, but I feel it's removed the sense of pride and skill which was an essential joy with the old time-honoured methods, which of course don't need electricity. Also in the deck department we have our quartermasters and our seamen. Since we didn't have an automatic pilot, the quartermasters kept watches and were responsible for steering the ship and keeping us on our course. For the rest of the seamen, whilst at sea, they were responsible for the maintenance of the cargo handling and mooring equipment, as well as the general condition of the ship. Here they're replacing a topping lift, which raises and lowers the derrick when in use. A new wire rope is being installed, an essential task since wires were extremely dangerous if not kept in perfect condition. Another task, endless but very necessary, was to keep the ship looking nice, and here the seamen are indulging in the time-honoured job of washing down, which we called soogieing. Hard-to-reach places were accessed using stages, as here, or a boatswain's chair for a single individual. This particular session was made necessary by an unfortunate oil spill on the foredeck, which covered everywhere in brown spots. Using the stage was a very usual task, and not at all dangerous, even if it appears to be so to modern eyes. Of course, having cleaned the paintwork, to keep it nice it was often necessary to repaint or to touch up, obviously being very careful of one's own safety while doing it. Around the accommodation the decks were covered with wood to provide a nice surface to walk on, and these also needed cleaning. Here you can see the seamen using water and holystones, large blocks of stone similar to sandstone with which the deck could be scrubbed clean. So, what were our jobs as deck cadets? Obviously, as future navigators, bridge work featured prominently. We also needed to become familiar with all aspects of the work on deck, so we naturally became involved in the general clean-up after the oil spill, with even the gangway being hoisted out to make access easier. Here one of us is using a boatswain's chair on the bridge front for the same purpose. These were like the seat of an old-fashioned child's swing, suspended from a pulley above. He uses a special knot in front of him so that he can lower himself under perfect control. Now we're learning how to create an eye in a wire rope, called a splice, an essential skill but very tricky and mucky. My colleague is using an iron tool called a marlinspike to tease the wire apart to insert the strands of the splice. A badly made splice in any type of rope could prove very dangerous, but especially so with wires, which posed a real danger to life if they snapped. However, whatever task we were given, it was always treated with the utmost dedication and seriousness, as you can see here. The finer points of swabbing the decks obviously needed discussion and experimentation. I'm sure that agreement was eventually reached, even if it took some considerable time. Off duty, two of us would share a cabin, similar to that of the radio officer. You can see that we could decorate it to our own tastes, and it provided a welcome space to relax and enjoy individual hobbies, always assuming that you got on well with your roommate. Even here, though, we would still have homework to do, since our exams were never too far in the future. Leisure activities varied tremendously depending on individual tastes. Obviously, darts played a major part in peaceful weather, and table tennis is also featured. In private, however, modelling, rug making, knitting and painting all featured as pastimes, and some famous authors learnt their craft at sea. Here we have a bit of DIY taking place on the foredeck. Any thoughts as to what's being constructed? It's obviously pretty substantial and heavy given the number of people involved. You've probably already guessed it. It's our high-tech swimming pool. This was a very popular resource, but could only be erected infrequently when conditions allowed. Since it would impede cargo handling, it had to be removed in port. While at sea, we need a long ocean crossing with good weather to make it worth the effort of putting it up. Rough seas would make it much too dangerous. Naturally, it was filled with seawater, using the fire hydrants, since fresh water was too valuable to waste. Although team games were very popular, it was obviously a good opportunity for showing off. However, occasionally I did feel that some of the antics could be construed as unwise, particularly standing up near the ship's side. Well, I hope you enjoyed this little peep into our world, but we'll now return to our journey. The distance from Aden to Trincomalee is just over 2,600 nautical miles, and takes about a week given good weather. Since we will be loading chests of tea there, we used the crossing to prepare the dunnage in the holds to keep it all dry. The word dunnage describes any material, such as scrap wood or protective sheets, used to protect the cargo in different ways. Wooden pallets are an example. The word is also sometimes used to describe our own personal effects. In this case, the dunnage consisted of thin wooden laths placed crosswise in 2 layers to prevent the chests from getting wet underneath. Sri Lanka lies off the southeastern tip of India, and we have to skirt round its southern tip and up the east coast. And here we are, arriving in Trincomalee's huge, beautiful bay, where we display the courtesy flag of Ceylon, and we'll be securing to mooring buoys. Since Trincomalee had no jetties at this time, the tea chests were brought out to the ship in barges, known as lighters, and unfortunately my duties prevented me from filming them. With the tea loaded and stowed securely, Australia now beckons. This is the longest crossing of our outbound voyage, heading south for about 3,500 miles, and it will take us about 9 days in all. When the ship is out of sight of land, the navigating officers regularly calculate our position using the ship's course and speed. This is known as our dead reckoning position, or DR for short. To assist in this task, we stream the log, which you've briefly seen earlier. A spinner is towed astern at the end of a rope, and the log converts the revolutions into distance in the same way that a car's mileage recorder works. Occasionally we find a slack line when reading it, which usually means that the spinner has provided a rather indigestible meal for a shark or similar fish. Our engineers work hard to keep the main engine driving us forward, but occasional breakdowns are inevitable, and a broken fuel pump means we need to stop for a while. As a result, we must display the day signal for a vessel not under command, the posh name for "sorry, we can't get out of your way." At night, the signal is changed to 2 red lights displayed vertically. Normally, if things were calm, these stoppages were of no consequence, but they could be dangerous if the weather turned nasty. This fault took about 10 hours to put right, and the weather remained peaceful throughout. This was rather fortunate, since, now underway again, we received a warning about a tropical revolving storm to the south of us. These unpleasant beasts only occur in the tropics, and can be very dangerous. They're known by a variety of names: hurricanes in the Atlantic, typhoons in the Western Pacific, and cyclones in the Eastern Pacific and Indian Oceans. Naturally, the Australians have their own name for them, having christened them Willy Willies. Wind speeds within them regularly exceed 75 knots, so they present a real threat, even to the largest of ships, and we always set our course to avoid them as far as possible. Fortunately, this storm was moving west, away from us, so apart from some pretty rough seas, we were in what was known as the safe zone. The main worry in this sort of bad weather is the danger of cargo shifting, which in severe cases can destabilise or even sink the ship. No problems on this occasion though. We're safely through and now approaching Fremantle Harbour in Western Australia. The approaches to any port are usually known as the roads, and occasionally, as now, we have to anchor there until our berth is free. While we wait for the pilot, we have an opportunity to have a distant look at Fremantle's shoreline. The pilot boat has now appeared in the distance, and it has a long way to come, so it's a good job the sea is calm. Imagine doing this in rough weather. You can see the H flag at the bow of the launch indicating its purpose. The pilot's ladder is rigged ready, and he is now boarding, to be led away to the bridge by a cadet. He is followed by the Health Department official, and finally, of course, the officer from the Australian Customs. The ever-essential paperwork brings up the rear. No such formalities would have greeted the original settlers when they arrived here at the entrance to the Swan River in 1829 to set up the original Swan River colony. The port now bears the name of their ship's commander, Captain Howe Fremantle, and was declared a city exactly 100 years later. As the port city for Perth, the capital of Western Australia, Fremantle is also the main commercial port in the state, with extensive facilities on both sides of the harbour. It was used as a huge Allied base for submarines in World War II. As we pass the wharves on our starboard side, the skyline is dominated by the impressive War Memorial on Monument Hill. Although only 140 feet in height, the hill is the highest natural point between the Indian Ocean and the Darling Ranges to the east of the city. It was used as a triangulation point by the original surveyors, and was then designated as a public park in 1904. It certainly provides the best views over the whole of Fremantle City, incidentally also giving us a nice view of the ship moored in the harbour. When it was suggested that the sacrifices of local people killed in World War I should be commemorated, the park was the obvious choice for the location of this magnificent memorial, which was eventually unveiled in 1928. This lovely road is taking us to Perth City, just 12 miles upstream. The beautiful location, where the Swan River widens into two large lakes, made it an obvious choice for the original colonists to establish their administrative centre. It was granted city status in 1856. In the late 19th century, discoveries of gold in the Western Australia region led to a huge increase in the city's population. Although the boom tailed off in the early 1900s, gold mining still contributes to the wealth of the state today. Following World War II, there was another large influx of immigrants from Europe, and the area's prosperity became assured with the discovery of huge reserves of iron ore in the north. With additional finds of nickel and alumina, mining now accounts for 70% of the state's revenue, with oil supplying the rest, making Western Australia the fourth richest state on the continent. This is the wonderful view from Kings Park, looking east over Perth Water, the smaller of the two lakes. The large area in the foreground is nowadays crisscrossed with the city's new road network, together with the railway to Fremantle. Perth Water and Melville Water are separated by the simple but elegantly beautiful Narrows Bridge, and I'm so very happy that rather than being replaced, it has now been augmented by a second identical one to allow for the increase in modern traffic. Kings Park is actually the largest inner city park in the world, and is situated on a hill called Mount Eliza, overlooking the river, and Kennedy Spring, the original freshwater source for the inhabitants, still flows. As well as the glorious views, it contains the city's botanical gardens and war memorial. 2/3 of the park are conserved as native bushland, and it's the most popular visitor destination in the whole state. The railway station marks the western end of the incredible 1,050-mile line across the Nullarbor Plain to South Australia, and steam was still in full use. I loved this beautiful city, which even then was a bustling, busy place. However, as you can see here, traffic problems are by no means a modern phenomenon. Unfortunately, our schedule is calling us back to the ship, but we still have time for a final exploration of the area down by the lake before taking the road back to Fremantle for our onward journey. We came into Perth on the northern side of Melville Water, so we're taking the southern route back, which is not perhaps quite so attractive. So, with our visit at an end, we leave the harbour, and we're passing one of the many slipways where ship repairs are carried out, and we'll head for the open sea. A distance of around 1,400 miles separates us from our next port of call, Adelaide, in South Australia, and will take us about 4 days. The major part is a crossing of the Great Australian Bight, which, since it's open to the turbulent winds of the Southern Ocean, is notorious for bad weather and heavy seas. We did encounter some unpleasantness this time, but any discomfort that we felt was obviously not shared by the large variety of seabirds, whose swooping aerobatics kept us amused for hours. They obviously don't suffer from seasickness. We reserved special admiration, however, for the spectacular wandering albatross, with their incredible wingspan of around 10 feet. They would soar above the ship, sometimes following for hours or even days on end, and only occasionally landing at night to feed. We've now reached Adelaide, the capital and main maritime gateway of South Australia, and we're passing the outer breakwater to enter the Port River. As you can see, a huge bend in the river divides the port into 2 harbours, situated on each side of the Lefebvre Peninsula, where the original town of Port Adelaide was situated, around 9 miles from the present city centre. Movements within the port were controlled from this conspicuous nerve centre, and we're now entering the outer harbour area. Today, these wharves, with their extensive facilities, provide the area's main container port, as well as the terminal for the huge visiting cruise ships. At the time of our visit, the outer harbour provided berths for the deep draught ships who were unable to proceed upstream, and we were lucky to have a sight of Her Majesty's Australian ship HMAS Melbourne, the Royal Australian Navy's flagship and only operational carrier. She was originally laid down as a light fleet carrier during the Second World War, but wasn't completed at that time. She was bought by the Royal Australian Navy in 1947, but only commissioned in October 1955 due to design improvements such as an angled flight deck. Now round the huge bend we're heading upstream, with Torrens Island to our left. As we proceed toward the inner harbour, the chief officer and carpenter stand by on the forecastle as a precaution in case of an emergency. The carpenter had responsibility for the anchors, so he was there to drop the hook if needed. We still have some way to go, with our berth being nearly 8 miles from the sea. One of the huge advantages that we had over our modern-day container ship counterparts was that, since our cargo handling was all done by hand, we were blessed with time to go ashore and explore the places that we were visiting. So we're now heading into the city to see some of the sights. This beautiful boulevard is typical of the approach roads leading to the centre. The first Surveyor General of South Australia was Colonel William Light, and his statue stands proudly on its plinth on Montefiore Hill, and he's pointing over the River Torrens to the city centre, which he designed. This lovely small park forms part of the area which he selected for the original settlement, and his vision resulted in an ideal layout for a city, with alternating wide and narrow streets on a grid system interspersed with 6 public squares. This is still considered to be one of the great planned metropolises, with the feel of a city in a park, due to over 2,300 acres of parkland surrounding it, which he intended to be preserved in perpetuity. Apparently nowadays the good Colonel is actually not able to see the centre that he's pointing to, due to the Adelaide Oval, which has been constructed here, not without controversy, I believe. The park is bordered to the south by the Torrens River, which divides the centre into 2 halves, north and south. We were most fortunate to also have the time to venture further afield, and the Mount Lofty mountain ranges to the east of the city were an obvious choice to visit. Sightseeing trips were readily available, so we're now on a small coach tour heading up into the countryside. The city centre, with its lovely broad avenues, really is a most enchanting place. The suburbs might present a much more down-to-earth appearance, but they also provide a very pleasant mix of homes and shops. Our visit took place in February, during the English winter, but here of course it was the height of the Australian summer, and the weather was very clear and warm, and everywhere was extremely dry, due to the recent lack of any proper rain. We're climbing up into the Adelaide Hills, as the lower slopes are known, as we head for our first destination, a viewpoint on Mount Lofty, overlooking the famous Piccadilly Valley. The valley area was used for a long time as a market gardening centre, producing food both for Adelaide itself and for export. Nowadays a large part of it is devoted to growing so-called cool climate grape varieties for the all-important wine industry. The Mount Lofty ranges stretch northwards for over 190 miles, and here in the southern part wine production is a major activity and includes the famous Barossa Valley label. As you can see, our lofty perch provides us with spectacular and extensive views over the whole area, giving us a lovely feel for the place. After a brief stop for refreshments, we're back on the road again, continuing our exploration of the mountains. Although obviously a popular location for residential development, large areas are maintained as conservation parks to prevent overdoing it. The southwest-facing mountains receive plenty of rainfall, which makes them an important water source for Adelaide, and here is one of the many supply pipelines in the area. There are several reservoirs in the region, and one of the biggest is Millbrook, which we can see through the trees. There had obviously been quite a lack of rain that year, however, since the water level was very low. The drive was very enjoyable, with the native eucalyptus trees everywhere. However, their resinous vapour presents a real danger of forest fires, which sometimes decimate the area. There were also lots of beautiful silver birch and golden acacia trees, and pine forests have been planted as an additional resource. While we've been out on the road, cargo handling has naturally been continuing, so let's return to the ship to have a look. Before the advent of computers, cargo stowage was the responsibility of the chief officer, and involved difficult decisions to ensure ease of unloading at each port while maintaining the ship's stability at sea in all weathers. We're just in time to see a car being unloaded from the 'tween deck, and underneath it you can see the hatch covers closing off the lower hold. A special frame provides a safe and hopefully damage-free transit, and the ship's derricks are being used rather than a dockside crane. Cars were a regular part of every trip, usually personal ones, although there were often new ones for export. The lower hatch covers have now been removed, and you can clearly see the 'tween deck, with its cargo temporarily shored up with dunnage until it can be secured for sailing. In the lower hold, bundles of steel are being discharged. Looking down into the lower hold, you get a vivid picture of the varied nature of our cargo. Since all of this had to be discharged by hand and was also vulnerable to pilfering, it's clear to see why containers have now been adopted. Once all cargo handling was complete, gangs of carpenters would then be employed to use the dunnage, which can be seen bottom right, to ensure that the cargo was secure for an ocean passage. One of our most important tasks throughout the voyage was to ensure that our safety equipment was working properly. We had 2 lifeboats, one on each side of the ship, and the cadets were tasked with checking the stores and water in the boats and keeping them fresh. We also had life rafts on each side, which would inflate when thrown into the water. Lifeboats were secured on davits, which you can see in this diagram. To lower the boat, a brake lever on the winch would be lifted, and the boat would then slide down under its own weight. To check the davits and the boat itself, a safe enclosed harbour like this was ideal, so here we are undertaking a lifeboat drill. Once the boat was lowered, each station was provided with an access ladder, similar to the pilot's, but longer. The usual method of manoeuvring a lifeboat was to use the oars, which you can see stowed at the side of the boat. Unusually, our boats were fitted with a system of levers, which were connected to a propeller shaft. These could be unshipped if the boat was too crowded. Following the Titanic disaster, where insufficient boats had been provided, regulations were introduced which required ships to have sufficient life-saving equipment on each side for everyone on board. Given the lack of protection in these open boats, my personal choice in a bad situation would have been to use a life raft, but I'm eternally grateful that I was never faced with the need to choose. So, having completed our drill, we return to the ship. The lifting wires, called falls, are hooked on, and the boat is hauled clear of the water to be returned to the davits. The Royal Australian Navy was much in evidence during our stay, and here we can see HMAS Voyager leaving for a cruise. She was the first of the Daring class, laid down in Sydney in 1949, and she entered service in 1957. In 1964 she was involved in a catastrophic incident with the Melbourne when making an unexpected turn across her bows. The resulting collision saw Voyager cut in half, with a loss of 14 officers and 67 sailors, including the captain, who was subsequently found to be negligent. When passing any man of war, a merchant ship was expected to dip her ensign, and you can see Voyager returning the compliment by dipping her own white ensign in acknowledgement. I always felt that naval ships at this time had a beauty and symmetry all their own, assuming that you could ignore their deadly purpose. When entering or leaving harbour, warships usually man the side, which gives the ship a very smart appearance. Well, having completed our visit, we're back at sea, and we must now move on to our next destination, Melbourne. This will be one of our shortest legs, but given the size of Australia, it will still take us a day and a half to cover the distance of around 550 miles. Melbourne lies at the entrance to the Yarra River, on the northern shore of the huge Port Phillip Bay, which was first explored in 1802. A convict colony was created in the area in 1803, but this only lasted a matter of months before being abandoned. The bay was then left undisturbed until Melbourne itself was founded in 1835. Here's a little map, cut from a local newspaper and showing how the port was created from scratch and how future expansion was planned. This photograph, printed in 1961, shows that the expansion was already underway when we visited. We were to go alongside at berth number 32, on the bend in the river. Well, they may have been expanding, but it's clear from these pictures that Melbourne was already one of Australia's busiest seaports, as indeed it still is today. Almost every inch of the riverside has some sort of facility and evidence, and apparently today the port is the biggest container terminal in the country. Visiting cruise ships, however, use Station Pier, which is in Port Phillip Bay, just outside the river entrance. Once again we had an opportunity for a run ashore, and a short taxi ride took my friends and me to Kings Park, an area of parkland first established in 1854 and now forming part of a larger area known as the Domain Parklands. Among other things, it contains Government House and the Botanic Gardens, and one attraction that I'd heard of and wanted to see was the Music Bowl, opened in February 1959. This extraordinary bowl was inspired by the philanthropist and violinist Sidney Meyer, who had established some free open-air concerts with the Melbourne Symphony Orchestra in 1929, a tradition which still continues, with 3 or 4 being given every year. His inspiration came after he visited the Hollywood Bowl in Los Angeles. The bowl has a canopy made of half-inch plywood, sheeted with aluminium on both sides and attached to a frame of steel cables. The current capacity is a little over 12,000, but it was the venue for the largest Southern Hemisphere crowd ever in 1967, when an estimated 200,000 people attended the homecoming of the Australian group The Seekers. I had the joy of attending a performance here by the Danish comedian Victor Borge, who kept a capacity crowd in stitches for nearly 3 hours. The park is also home to the Shrine of Remembrance, one of the largest war memorials in Australia, dedicated on Remembrance Day 1934. Its location provides a splendid view of the city's skyline on the other side of the Yarra River. Since I was sharing the cost of the taxi with my 4 colleagues, we decided to make a day of it and visit the Dandenong Ranges, just 22 miles to the east of the city. These heavily forested hills give wonderful views over the region. They were apparently a major source of timber for the early settlers of Melbourne, and today are a very popular destination for day trippers. Much of the area now forms the Dandenong Ranges National Park. Since the main tree cover consists of the native eucalyptus, there's a very high risk of fire, and I was amused to see Australian humour even here, with large prominent signs proclaiming "One flaming match, no flaming trees," and "Matches have heads but no brains," which have remained in my memory ever since. This visit happened to coincide with an air carnival at Moorabbin Airfield, now one of the busiest airports for general aviation in Australia, and it proved irresistible for me. This popular show had the usual mix seen at any such event, from vintage aircraft to the most modern. Naturally, pleasure flights were a great draw, with this float-plane helicopter performing sterling work all afternoon. Unfortunately, an apprentice's budget did not stretch to such things, so I could only watch wistfully from the sidelines. This particular aircraft is interesting historically, though, since it carries the markings of Ansett ANA, then a major airline based in Melbourne, which only ceased operations in 2001. Naturally, some of the show was devoted to those odd people who were obsessed with jumping out of aeroplanes for a quick plummet to earth hanging on bits of string. I have to say that this has never been on my own wish list at any time, but I do enjoy watching and marvelling at their precision. It's worth noting, however, that they were still using the old-style canopies, rather than the flying wing types prevalent today. Of course, aerobatics also formed an essential part of a very pleasant afternoon, and the old tiger moths such as this one are still performing and providing basic training to this day. The glorious weather provided unlimited scope for many other types to be put through their paces, and I particularly like this beautifully executed 4-point roll. In this age of mass air travel, it's impossible to understand the excitement that surrounded aviation in the early 60s. After all, Gatwick Airport had only been adopted as London's second hub in 1958, just under 4 years earlier, and flying was still an exciting adventure. The introduction of the British jet-powered Comet was marred by tragedy, and here we have a sight of the then new Boeing 707, which, benefiting from the lessons learned, really started it all, finally ending the age of scheduled seagoing passenger travel. So, all work complete, we now move on to Sydney, our next destination. As we cross Port Phillip Bay, there's time to reflect on a very pleasant visit. Despite being the second most populous city on the continent, Melbourne seemed to have an old-world charm, which welcomed a visitor in a quiet and unassuming way. I'm not in the least surprised that in 2017 it retained the title of World's Most Livable City for the 7th time in a row. The 600-mile trip to Sydney takes a little under 2 days, much the same as the transit from Adelaide to Melbourne. Since the weather has become more peaceful and spray-free, this offers us a chance to paint the foredeck and make it look nice. Although the Sydney area was originally visited by Captain Cook in 1770, the first settlement by Europeans was a penal colony, established at Botany Bay a few miles to the south in 1788. This was soon abandoned in favour of Sydney Harbour. Convict transportation ended in the mid-19th century, but the discovery of gold in 1851 started a rush of immigrants, leading to Sydney becoming Australia's first city. Following World War II, a scheme was set up offering an assisted passage for £10, around £400 today, which required a 2-year stay. The scheme ended in 1982, but resulted in a huge influx of new residents. It was also possible to work your passage by signing on to a ship in the UK and signing off in Australia. The harbour area for Sydney is known as Port Jackson, and we're now in the largest natural haven in the world, passing Fort Denison, which is now a national park. The original convicts were not locked up, so this little island was levelled and used as a jail, with offenders put on a diet of bread and water, and it was thus originally known as Pinchgut. It was then used to protect the harbour, and its Martello Tower was the last one constructed in the British Empire and the only one in Australia. Even if we'd been dropped in blindfold, this bridge would instantly tell us where we are, since it must be one of the most well-known bridges in the world. Our berth is on the far side. To our left, on the port beam, you can see the construction site, which was to become the amazing Sydney Opera House, with the passenger terminal and P&O liner Canberra visible behind. We've now entered the Parramatta River area, beyond the bridge, and are turning round so that we can berth starboard side too, at what was then known as Dalgety's Wharf, our own jetty, since it belonged to the Shore Saddle Line at that time. From here we get a good view to the west, where we can see not only the heavily used shoreline upstream, but also the suburbs, stretching down to the water's edge, and which were a much sought after location. Since the bridge dominates the area, it might be worth providing a few facts about it. Opened in 1932, it's the 6th longest spanning arch bridge in the world, and is still the tallest at 440 feet from the top to the water level. The granite-faced pylons at each end actually have no structural purpose, but were added to allay public concern about the bridge's integrity. Their granite blocks were cut, dressed and numbered in the quarry before being taken to the site, which shows that flat packs were not invented by IKEA. However, the towers are naturally used for other purposes. For example, the northern pair provide chimneys for the road tunnel beneath the harbour, while the southeastern one houses a museum and tourist centre. It was only a short distance from our berth, so it made an obvious starting place to explore, and to provide us with a grand view of the city. Close to, one gets a real sense of its majestic size and presence. This contemporary view gives an idea of what we can see from our vantage point on the bridge, and shows the harbour entrance, known as the Heads, with the famous Bondi Beach at the edge of the Pacific Ocean. We'll start our tour at Circular Quay to the south, where the passenger ships berthed and which is now used by cruise ships. We get an excellent view of the SS Canberra from here. She was very new at the time, having only made her maiden voyage in June 1961, offering scheduled passenger services from the UK. However, airlines were already a problem, so in 1974 she started a successful new career as a cruise liner without needing major external alterations. In 1982 she served as a troop ship in the Falklands War, before returning to cruising until her final voyage in 1997. Circular Quay is a popular tourist area, and as we continue, here are the foundation works of another soon-to-be iconic Sydney landmark, the beautiful and controversial Opera House, then in the early stage of its construction. It wasn't formally opened until October 1973. Now we have a spectacular view over the eastern part of Port Jackson, as we sweep round to the north to the area known as the North Shore, a much sought-after area of residential suburbs. We can now get up close and personal with this amazing structure, designed and built by the Middlesbrough steel firm of Dorman Long and Company. As you can see, it carries both road and rail traffic, as well as pedestrians. Continuing our scan, we have a nice view of our ship, all snug at Dalgety's Wharf, and zooming out a bit, we follow with the panoramic view of the Parramatta River area that we saw earlier from the quayside. Finally, the circle ends at the southern approach road to the bridge, with a look at the main centre of the city. The bridge also provides a vantage point for the maritime version of train spotting, since it provides a lovely bird's-eye view of incoming ships. This fairly new oil tanker is typical of the post-war types operating in the 1960s, and she seems very nicely maintained. No stay in Sydney would be complete without a visit to the world-famous Bondi Beach, just south of the harbour entrance. Even then its popularity is obvious, and I believe that nowadays it's been divided up to provide dedicated areas for the different beach activities. Bondi is famous for its surf, and surfboat racing was very popular. These boats, originally designed for life-saving in heavy surf conditions, were apparently not very effective in that role, but they proved irresistible to the competitive nature of the young Australian male, and I believe that surfboat racing is still as popular today. On the North Shore there are of course many more beaches just as beautiful, such as this one, which I think is Mona Vale Beach. When I was there most of them seemed deserted, which puzzled me until I realised that of course they had no lifeguards or protection from sharks. 25 miles north of the city, Barrenjoey Headland marks the northern tip of Palm Beach on the long peninsula which forms the eastern side of the beautiful bay known as Pittwater. Palm Beach is now famous for being the location of the fictional town called Summer Bay in the TV series Home and Away. Even then, it was a very expensive area for housing. Pittwater is a popular area for all types of water activities, but is also home to many beautiful natural wetlands such as mangroves, salt marsh, seagrass and sand flats. Well, with our visit at an end, we now leave Sydney with a spectacular sight of the bridge at night behind us to call at our last Australian destination before we head home. Brisbane is our final port of call, another short northward hop of 475 miles, taking around a day and a half. It's one of the oldest cities on the continent, having originally been an offshoot of Sydney's penal colony. Once opened to free settlement in 1842, it became the state capital when Queensland was declared a separate colony in 1859. The city has a somewhat similar situation to Melbourne, being at the inland end of a large bay called Moreton Bay. This gives it a very safe location, since it's protected from the Pacific waves by the barrier islands offshore. Nowadays, an artificial island has been built at the entrance to the river, which serves as the container port, but when we were there, the port consisted of a number of wharves along the river, and ours lay right in the heart of the city, nearly 9 miles from the river entrance. We're moored very close to the Albert Railway Bridge, completed in 1895 and now on the state's heritage list, and which replaced the first bridge, which was destroyed by floods. Queensland's architecture is well known, and this splendid city hall is typical. It's one of the city's finest buildings and was once the tallest. It was finally formally opened in 1930. This is an original photo taken at the time, and this splendid marble foyer is worth a visit on its own. Although our visit was rather short from the exploring point of view, this little boat gave me a chance of a trip up the Brisbane River to see a bit of the country upstream. The river is very beautiful, but does have one major drawback. It has a history of flooding, with episodes in 1974 and in 2011 having been really severe and damaging to the city, with many lives lost. Needless to say, waterfront properties do command very high prices in spite of the flood risk. When quiet, however, as it is today, the river obviously provides a popular playground for water sports. The impressive Queensland University has a lovely situation within a curve of the river, just 4 miles upstream from the city centre. The real purpose of my cruise, however, was to visit the Lone Pine Koala Sanctuary, the oldest of its kind in Australia. As you can see from this sign, it's not a zoo, but is dedicated to preserving indigenous wildlife from the continent, and particularly the iconic koala bear. When the sanctuary was originally set up in 1927, this little chap was hunted for his fur and was becoming endangered. They were very easy prey, since they normally spend much of their day asleep due to the poor nutritional value of the eucalyptus leaves, which are their main diet. Surprisingly, they were unusually active during our visit, which gave us a privileged view into their lives. They really are most irresistible animals, and can apparently be tamed, although the centre does discourage this, since they want to be able to reintroduce them to the wild eventually. This would be their normal habitat, secure and peaceful in a treetop. A hugely popular draw with everyone was this combination, cuddly bear and man's best friend, who seem to be pretty well bonded. What's not to like here? For me, as a first-time visitor to Australia, the sanctuary was an irresistible draw, providing, as it did, an opportunity to see and handle some of the most amazing and unique beasts which this extraordinary continent produces in such abundance. So I was delighted to make the acquaintance of the kangaroo, without doubt surely the animal most associated with this region. They may be considered a pest in some areas, but they're fascinating nonetheless. Then we visited these beautiful sulphur-crested cockatoos, which are native to Australia and can often be seen in wooded areas in quite large numbers. These were followed by the stunningly beautiful Major Mitchell's cockatoo, usually found in arid or semi-arid areas, and now unfortunately a threatened species. We also had a quick glimpse of the emu, made famous by Rod Hull on TV in the 1970s. I still have very pleasant memories of this visit, which was my last before we headed for home, having completed our cargo work here. Another enjoyable aspect of serving in a general cargo ship at this time was that, although each voyage had a number of standard ports which were visited every trip, frequently additional ports would be added to the itinerary as cargo demands came up. So it was on this voyage, since on our way home we'll be visiting the Australian ports of Newcastle and Wallaroo to load grain, some in bags, but also in bulk into some of our deep tanks. We will then be calling at Galle in Sri Lanka to load further supplies of tea, followed by a return call to Port Sudan, this time to load cotton. Unusually, some of the cargo that we have loaded is destined to be discharged in Aden and in Port Said, and we also have an unexpected call to Genoa in Italy, which is well off our normal route. We'll be heading back around the south coast, and after visiting Wallaroo we will head for Sri Lanka before returning to Aden and Suez, so this will give us time to consider the cargo in a little more detail. Our outbound cargo has been distributed to the various ports, with the previously mentioned heavy digester vessel being discharged in Melbourne and the alkane detergent in Sydney. Exports from Australia obviously always included bales of wool in bulk, and this time was no exception. We also loaded a large consignment of bags of flour, some of which was destined for Aden, and in addition to the usual personal effects, there was a quantity of canned goods, especially canned fruit, together with 50 tons of honey, hogsheads of wine, sultanas, molasses, and bags of rice. Beer lovers in the UK were catered for by a large consignment of bagged barley, which required special measures to avoid it becoming wet, since, apart from spoiling it, this would also cause it to swell, which could be very dangerous. This meant that all metal surfaces in the hold had to be covered with waterproof paper, and thick dunnage was laid underneath. My notes also mention a quantity of shells and several tons of rutile sand, which apparently is used in the production of titanium, as well as a brilliant white additive in the manufacture of paint and paper. 4 weeks and 10,000 miles later, with Sri Lanka, Aden and Port Sudan behind us, we've reached Suez Bay, where we must anchor to wait for the northbound convoy. The anchor falls under its own weight and is controlled by the ship's carpenter using the windlass. Contrary to popular belief, it's not the anchor itself which secures the ship, but the weight of the cable laying along the seabed. The anchor simply stops the cable moving. Having dropped the anchor, the ship then moves slowly astern, with the cable being paid out through the hawse-pipe as the tension comes on. Periodically links are painted white to indicate the length paid out. The cable is fed from the cable locker and over the windlass, and the carpenter uses the brake to control the speed of release. Sitting at anchor in nice weather is very peaceful, and as we scan round we can see that this convoy is going to be a large one. Ship watching was always interesting, and the sheer variety of ship types and their countries of origin was amazing. Having received our orders to move, the windlass is now used to recover the anchor, and a hose-pipe is deployed to wash the mud off the cable as it comes in. Dried mud left in place can be rather dangerous, as it flies off when we use the anchor again and is almost like bits of concrete. The section of the cable nearest to the anchor is normally painted white, so that it looks ship-shape when stowed, and this is what we watch for as the cable is recovered. The anchor itself is difficult to clean with a hose, so when the painted section appears, recovery is stopped, and we can then leave the anchor itself hanging in the water. As the ship gets underway and picks up speed, the remaining mud is washed off, and the beautifully clean pick, as we affectionately call it, can be safely stowed. We're now heading back into the canal for our northbound transit, and we cover the southern section without incident. As is normal, the northbound convoy has priority over the southbound, and we're passing its ships anchored in the Great Bitter Lake. Once again you can see how important this waterway was to the world of shipping, just as it is today. This time our daytime transit enables us to see Ismailia on Lake Timsah, where the pilots change, and where the headquarters of the Suez Canal Authority is based. After our passage, we spend the night here at Port Said at the northern end of the canal, discharging some of the bales of wool which are apparently destined for onward shipment to Istanbul. Having finished, we move on to Genoa in Italy, our final port of call, which is about 1,600 miles from Port Said, and which will take us roughly 4.5 days. Italy was definitely outside our normal cargo runs, so we looked forward to adding a new destination to our list of ports that we had visited. Genoa lies at the northern tip of the Ligurian Sea, nearly at the edge of Italy where it borders with France. Nestling like a little amphitheatre at the base of the Apennine Mountains, the port is one of the most important in the Mediterranean and is one of Italy's major economic centres. We'll be securing to the Molo Vecchio, or Old Mole, in the centre of the harbour. Since our berth was all ready for us, we were able to pass through the harbour roads, and the number of anchored ships waiting their turn shows how important the port was even then. As we take in the panoramic view of the old harbour, we get further evidence of the bustling nature of the port, since almost every wharf has a ship alongside, busily loading and unloading cargo from every corner of the globe. We are here to discharge part of our huge consignment of wool bales, together with some of the cotton that we loaded in Port Sudan. Fortunately, my duties meant that I was again able to spend some time ashore, and this impressive central railway station drew me like a magnet. Originally opened in 1854, the station was expanded over the years and now handles over 60,000 passengers a day to destinations both in France and all over Italy. An unusual coincidence gave me a special reason for enjoying myself here. Our visit occurred while my parents were staying in Italy, studying the language at the University for Foreigners in Perugia. My mum slipped away from her studies briefly, naughty girl, and here she is, having come up to meet me for the one afternoon that we could spend together. We decided to visit the heights above the city to see the views, and, if the truth be known, since I also love funicular railways. This is one of 3 that were in use in Genoa at the time, and it was opened in 1891. Originally it was operated by a system where a ballast tank underneath the car was filled with water at the top, and the train then would descend under its own weight before the water was released at the bottom. The views may have been hazy, but were certainly worth the trip. As we pan round to the south, we get a sight of the Mystic, secure on the old mole. The anchored ships waiting in the roads outside are also plainly visible, and the old breakwater has now been greatly extended. Here we can see over the main part of the crowded old city. In addition, the heights enable us to see behind the hills, into the valley of the very short Entella River, which flows down into the harbour from the Apennine Mountains. Altogether, this interlude provided a very welcome break from our usual routine, and we both enjoyed it a lot. With the cargo handling complete, it now remains for us to head home. Once again we must pass the Gibraltar Straits into the Atlantic before turning north again for the final leg to the UK. When approaching from the east we get a very different view of the rock, the most prominent feature being the huge water catchment area covering the eastern face. Fresh water supplies have always been a problem here, and this enormous catchment was built in the early 1900s to feed rainwater into underground cisterns deep in the rock. It was apparently not all that successful, and was removed in 1991, with the area reverting to nature. 90% of the drinking water for the rock is now supplied by desalination plants, with salt water being used for sanitary and firefighting purposes. The apparently solid rock is actually honeycombed with military tunnels and batteries, some of which are now open to the public. Through the Straits and into the Atlantic, we had an uneventful trip home, enlivened by the occasional passing ship and the sight of this little fishing fleet off the northern coast of Spain. Finally, this Royal Naval submarine, leaving for its patrol, shows that we're passing the Isle of Arran on our way up to Glasgow, where I will be leaving the ship. I'd like to end the trip with a little observation. It was always lovely to see all these other places and to admire their individuality, but the staggering beauty of our own wonderful country always filled me with joy, as here at Gordale Scar near Malham Tarn, so popular today with walkers and climbers. I was spending my leave with friends here in Yorkshire, while my parents were away, so I was able to explore this fabulous area, ending in probably my favourite dale, Dentdale, with its beautiful River Dee, where I could spend hours in peace. Well, I do hope you've enjoyed this glimpse into our world, showing a way of life now consigned to history. I'd like to end by thanking Google Earth for all the maps which I've been able to use, and finally to add my thanks to you for watching.